With the release of Fusion World, every color has 3 leaders that can dictate how you will play out your strategy, with many of them varying the playstyle by quite a bit. Unlike my reviews for the other cards in the set, with the leaders, I want to use a tier list because it's more of a conversation piece. I don't think leaders necessarily fit in the same bucket as regular cards because of so much of how they're good is based around the kit around them. So in that regard, I think it's more important to talk a little bit more nuance when we're talking about the leaders and kind of where they fit in. And even then, this tier list is much more of a, this is kind of where they fit in regards to the big picture, more so than this leader's good, this leader's bad, because I think it's all contextual.
And also because it's way easier to edit.
Okay, so here we go. And this time actually, I've decided to include these starter deck leaders because I think they're just easy slot-ins to be a part of the conversation, especially with the fact that like when we're looking at like yellow and green, they're very centralizing leaders to their color. A little bit less for blue. Vegeta's still incredibly good, and then it kind of varies on the meta. And then obviously I think there's a lot of conversation around Goku not being so hot. So in terms of what we've got, the tiering, before we even go into anything, I have the top as the green tier, and we're gonna get into that in a little bit of a moment. But I think at the very top, it is hard to dissuade us from saying that green is incredibly powerful. And with the way that all their different leaders line up, we're gonna get into it, but just know that that's kind of where it all kicks off. After that, we have meta. These are leaders that are great out of the gate alongside with their kits that are relatively strong, and they're leaders you're likely to see in large quantities as you play out in tournaments on the ladder whenever the client comes out. Then we've got rogue leaders and strategies that you kind of need to choose your moments when they're the right time to use, because they can be extremely strong if the meta looks a certain way, but outright horrendous if the meta is ready for you and teched against you. Then we have leaders with potential. These are leaders that may not have the right kit or are just really generically strong, but don't maybe have everything they need to be meta right out of the gate, but have room to grow or just need a couple of more pieces to be able to get there. And then finally, we have lacking, and these are leaders where the kit's not there and they themselves kind of don't provide too much to the current metagame to really be able to carve themselves a position. At the end of the day, I think there's overlap, right? I think there are leaders that have potential that with the right build can push themselves to be meta. I think that's also true for rogue, even for lacking, depending on if people write the fine build. And that's kind of why I want to do this video this way, because it's a little bit more fluid and contextual to like, it's a conversation piece more so than like looking at a card and just kind of knowing that this is a bad card. Hey guys, editor Espira here. I just wanted to clarify that this isn't a deck tier list for the most part. A lot of these leaders can actually have multiple builds, especially when you look into blue and yellow. Where the decks land will be a little bit more specific. I don't want to do a deck tier list until we actually have metadata based on community tournaments and data from the client. So at the moment, I don't feel comfortable doing a deck tier list, which is why I haven't done it yet. Naturally, a lot of these leaders have their strongest builds, and in that regard, we'll probably kind of line up similar to this graph, but I'm leaving myself room to say this is not necessarily where specific decks will lead up, whether we're talking about the 2 or 3 different builds of say Frieza or Goku Black. So keep in mind that this is very specific to what these leaders do and where the leaders fit in around based their typical strategies, as opposed to what a definitive deck tiering / meta would look like. With that out of the way, I think I need to explain green. And the thing with green is that it's an incredibly impactful, powerful color. It has the most powerful top end in the game at the sacrifice of some early game. But the thing is that with the way that the leaders line up, any pivot in the format means that you can just take most of what you're already doing with one green deck and just pivot to a different leader and deal with that situation so much better. For example, the solution to dealing with the green deck for the most part is to aggro them down. Put a lot of pressure on them, which prevents them from being able to reach the late game so that they're not able to actually just kind of smash you down. And let's say they're doing that with a low to the ground yellow deck that attacks you with a bunch of 20Ks. Well, now we can pivot from say Sun Gohan or Android 17 and 18 over to Broly, and now we're a 25k base awakened leader, which means the opponent needs to dump more cards into our leader, which gives us that flex to be able to gain advantage and make it easier for us to be able to push into the late game. Then if all of that pivots into us seeing a bunch of Brolys and being in a green mirror world, then we can pivot to Gohan or the androids, which have a much easier time attacking into Broly. And for what it's worth, a lot of this is theory because we don't actually have a meta yet, but kind of seeing how it plays out, you kind of have this revolving door in which green can pivot to any which leader that best suits for the meta and still really be a top dog threat. Now, this could be totally wrong, right? Between the right red aggro decks and the yellow aggro decks, there could be a way in which it ends up being a bit more of a revolving door across all the different colors. But out the gate, I think green is so incredibly strong in the options that it has in the top end that it has, and the fact that all the different leaders kind of pivot really well into each other, that I think they really are a category of their own at this very time. Now that we have that elephant out of the way, I do think we can jump into the different colored leaders, and kicking it off with U7 Goku. This is the one that's able to buff the entire board, and I think this will be a meta strategy for two reasons. One, I think people just really like Universe 7. They like their Gokus, they like that arc, so they're going to play those cards, especially given that this leader works best with Universe 7, even though you got the starter deck, but the starter deck's more generic. There's not much reason to not be using this leader. It's a straightforward strategy, and it's a solid strategy. It has a lot of very powerful cards. The red base is incredibly solid, but I think this is one that doesn't scale with the future incredibly well, because it'll only ever be as good as the U7 package is. And as we know, Bandai with power creep, it's not always going to be the case. I do think that we're going to get some additional U7 support for a couple of sets potentially, but I'm not holding my breath. And I think it's one of those things where at the moment it's very solid, but the longevity of the deck is a bit in question. But between the board control, between the pressure pieces and the late game, I think this deck positions itself incredibly well to kick off and kind of deal with everything. Red feels like that deck that I don't know if it's ever going to be the best deck. I think it has potential to do so, but it feels like it can have game against anything, because the way that its removal suite lines up, you can actually deal with almost anything, unlike every color that has a couple of caveats. Like how yellow can't really deal with big bodies, neither can blue. Red can kind of all together deal with a little bit of everything with a combination of a few cards. In that same realm, I think Beerus also falls under meta. It's a little bit weird because I'm not the biggest fan of the crit side, front side leaders. I'm not in the camp that like, oh, crit Beerus frontside is absolutely horrendous. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I do think that his backside is much stronger, especially as it fits into a control shell. And that's kind of where I find it weird that you put like a control style leader to have a crit frontside, because you want them to actually accrue hand advantage to be able to mitigate what your opponent is doing. So it's just weird. The front side is weird with what it feels like the backside of this leader wants to do. But nevertheless, Beerus makes it very annoying to play against. It is a deck that we're probably going to see very often, because anyone who wants a control style gameplay can just gravitate towards this and manipulate a hand that deals with essentially any board. Not gonna lie, he is carried by the fact that the red card pool is incredibly solid. I think just off the back of the leader, he's not fully there, but because the kit revolves around Beerus so well, I think it positions itself incredibly well. When we look at the starter deck leader, this is one where I think it's more potential. It's more generic. He works with any red battle card to give them an additional 5k boost, and that means that he obviously scales with the entirety of the game. The more red cards we get, the more we may have benefits to having ones that can offensively and defensively be given an additional 5k boost to kind of make that combat math annoying for your opponent and accrue you slight advantages turn over turn over turn. Carve that in with a little bit of tournament power arena and similar abilities, and you can have a really annoying leader. I know that there's talks around the community right now about using like cards like Botamo to be able to kind of go in this build, and that's very annoying. Having a 25k attacker that your opponent needs to use removal to get rid of is fairly annoying, and I think it's the right way to think about the starter deck leader if you want to use him. The thing with the starter deck leader though is opportunity cost. I think I've heard a lot of people say like, oh, he's bad, he's trash, and I don't even think he's bad at all. I think the red card pool does a lot to carry any red leader you want to play. But when you think about what you're giving up opportunity cost wise, I think the others serve better. The U7 Goku from the main set needs to put zero effort into being able to establish and push a wide board that accounts for multiple cards worth of advantage. If you just have a 3-card board that can attack into your opponent, already there you're counting for 15k worth of combo, which is you gaining essentially a card and a half worth of advantage off of one turn, and you do that over turn over turn over turn, which is what makes the strategy incredibly strong. With Beerus, you're gaining a essentially full card's worth of value depending on how you line it up with your other destruction abilities. So with Goku, it's a little bit more nuanced, and in that regard, you just don't gain it instantaneously. But I don't think he's bad. And I think he only ever scales more with the more cards that we get in the set. So this is where I think he's not an immediate meta threat. I think a lot of people are going to gravitate to the other red leaders. But if you play against it, I think the red shell in general is good enough to actually force you to have a game. And you'll find that there are some scenarios where he can be really annoying with his plusing ability. I already know that, like, I faced one time and every single turn I was forgetting that you can give 5k. Now that's just getting used to it and like just kind of getting in the head of things. But regardless, I don't think this leader is amazing, but I give it in the potential slot because of how much it scales with future design. But with the release of additional red leaders, I can very much see this leader being one that falls into irrelevance instead. So I'm kind of just tossing it up there as a, it can kind of go either way. It's not bad. The red card pool is good enough that if you want to run the starter deck leader, you can probably still do fine. Shifting over to blue, and blue is a bit of a tough conversation because of the prevalence of green. It's a tempo oriented color that goes fast, but it doesn't go incredibly fast. It has some cool combos in which you can attack with 25Ks and 35Ks for reasonably cheap, which lines up well with the Gohans and Brolys of the world, but it's tough to see where it carves itself in terms of long-term usability. To kick it off with Trunks, I think it's tough because I think there's a couple of slots in which I can put Trunks. Part of me wants to put him in potential, part of me wants to put him in meta, and I think meta is kind of where he's going to land. He's a fan favorite character, and for what it's worth, at the end of the day, the meta is just what you're expected to play more often than not. So when we look at favorite characters, you have to consider the popularity of Universe 7 when we're talking about what people are going to play. When you're talking about green, people love Teen Gohan. They love that arc. It's the favorite of all time for a lot of people out there. So odds are people are going to play it. And in that same regard, people love future Trunks. The Goku Black arc was an extremely popular arc, except for its ending, but nevertheless, and that can't be dismissed. In terms of playability, the leader's extremely strong. He awakens extremely quickly when you look at the support of cards like Mei and his other self-awakeners. And on his backside, he can utilize cards more often that he wants to on play or attack with because of his bounce. And then you can just bounce something that's really annoying on your opponent. If you're playing against an opposing yellow deck, you can just bounce their 2 or 3 drops back to their hand. And that tempo game is kind of very relevant for what the decks are trying to do. So I love his flexibility. And I think that flexibility means that there's a lot of potential there for multiple variants of decks to kind of warp with the meta. Do you need to be lower to the ground? Bet we're going to be slamming 1 drops and 2 drops, getting a bunch of value, bouncing him back to our hand to be able to get more combo power. And I think that synergizes incredibly well when you consider the 1-drop toolkit of peel off and everything surrounding that. But I think there's room in which it can struggle. If you play against yellow aggro, you need to skew your build. But after having analyzed all the blue cards, I think if the meta were to shift that way, I think the tools do exist for blue to be able to deal with that. And if you want to see my review of every color in the main set, all the videos are up on the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for even more breakdowns. And in that regard, because of the flexibility of the leader, because of the flexibility of the blue toolkit, I think it can position itself really well because you can go tall, you can go wide. So it feels like blue does have what it needs in its card pool to be able to shift with the meta, which means that it'll keep it in relevancy. It's not like if the meta shifts one way, blue's like, oh no, what am I going to do? And then it needs to sit in the rogue category until it's time to shine. Alternatively, Goku Black is what I will put in the rogue position, because there's 2 ways to play Goku Black. You can play 1-drop turbo with a crit leader and just kind of play aggro. And I think if the meta lines up itself well, that can get there. Aggro decks will just get there. But then I think where the problem lies is that if that strategy ever gets too good, your opponents can just play 2-drop blocker turbo, because 1-drop blocker turbo is a little bit susceptible to the 1-drop removal of Zamasu, and just consistently keep your opponent off board while you kind of build a board and then close out from there. And then alternatively, there's the 6-drop build, but the problem with the 6-drop Goku, which like tempoing that card out is insane, is the fact that Zamasus are kind of all really bad. You have like 1 blocker, which is like a pseudo vanilla half the time. You have 1 actual vanilla, and then you have 1 card that sometimes kind of does nothing. But in a world in which they release more 1-drops, one that like cantrips and one that gives you a little bit more utility, I think it could position itself decently well. But at the moment, I think as a Goku Black player, you need to choose your moments. Are you primed to be able to kind of aggro out and take benefit of the fact that everyone's kind of going for these late game strategies and punish with a bunch of crit swings and getting infinite value off of your peel offs and bouncing them back and everything around that? Then I think it can be incredibly strong. But I think once people decide to pivot over to the more mid-rangey stuff, while the Goku Black stuff is very powerful, I think because of your crit side, and when you're leaning to more mid-rangey stuff, you would rather kind of draw as opposed to be applying pressure with a crit leader, then things get a little bit more iffy. So I think Goku Black at the moment with the card pool available is a choose your battle type situation. But there are scenarios in which I think it could sneak up to meta. It is definitely an annoying strategy to have to face and something you have to consider. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I actually sat here for a solid few minutes kind of wondering, where do we put Vegeta? And the thing with Vegeta is that it almost feels like he doesn't do too much in regards to just buffing himself up as a leader. But when you think about the fact that you're going to be facing green Gohans that are 35k base once they have set up, or the fact that you'll be facing the Broly's that are 25k base just off rip, I think Vegeta lines himself up incredibly well to dealing with those strategies. At least in the starter deck format, I feel extremely confident as a Vegeta player playing against a green deck. How's that scale when we go into the main set? I'm not entirely sure. And I will say Vegeta naturally doesn't use the 1-drop loop as effectively as Trunks does because of the flexibility of being able to bounce your own cards and things like that. Nevertheless, I think Vegeta positions himself as someone that can put a lot of pressure, and going into the late game, I think positions himself where it's like your opponent never feels comfortable going down to 1 life just because of how heavy a 35k swing can be. He still has the benefit that the blue card pool is very flexible. It can turbo awaken, can apply pressure, can play tempo, can play late game. So in that regard, I think because of how well it lines up into what I'm expecting the top of the meta to be, I'm okay with putting him at meta, with the reality that he might not necessarily stay there and you see him all that often. But I think in the regards of where the blue decks kind of fit in, and with the fact that he's a star deck leader and that naturally is going to pump up his usage regardless because people just like playing with what they have out of the deck. He's a popular character, yada, yada, yada. But he's definitely the one I feel the most iffy placing. It almost feels like Vegeta doesn't really fit fantastically anywhere, more so than any other leader here. Shifting over to yellow, and we'll kick it off with Ginyu, and Ginyu is the like premier rogue strategy. He's incredibly aggressive. He has OTK potential, and he auto loses to red. And I think that's kind of what encompasses the notion of having to pick your moments in the meta. Oh, have people shift away from the red stuff because it's not dealing so well with the way that people are playing with the blue and green stuff? I have such a great position to be able to aggro out and apply so much pressure. But even within that context, it's a lot harder to do when your opponent's, say, playing a green Broly, and now all your 20Ks need to combo up. And then if Ginyu ever gets too prevalent, people are like, okay, well, we'll play red, I'll drop Frost, I auto win, and then if that even doesn't get me there, I can board wipe you 2 or 3 times and then guarantee the win from there. So because it can get so easily hated out, but can carve positions itself in the meta if you choose your right timing, it is the premier rogue strategy in my opinion. Next up, we jump over to Cooler, and Cooler is incredibly weird because I like what his ability does. It is nice that you get the ability to be able to restand and swing with 40Ks. It is nice that you have the ability to be able to restand your energy if you want it, but he has no real supporting kit. His armored squadron almost does nothing with him. They like kind of work with a restanding motif, but not even really in a way that feels incredibly good. You just kind of accrue mediocre value. And the best ways I've seen people play with Cooler is using the Ginyu engine, which the Ginyu engine is just the premier yellow aggro build in general, and I don't even think Cooler is the best one at doing it. Again, outside of having the nice niche that on the top end you can swing with 40Ks twice, and that kind of makes up for the fact that it makes your red matchup arguably a little bit better because you're not so all in on just a bunch of 20Ks. He is the leader that I feel the most desire to wanting to put into lacking, because it just feels like anytime I build a Cooler deck, I'm like, but why wouldn't I just play Frieza? Why wouldn't I just play Ginyu? I think he's on par with Ginyu in regards to how they use the Ginyu engine. I just think at that point, I would rather be more thematic and go into Ginyu. But again, he has the flex of being able to gain himself some energy. So it's like, he almost slots into potential, he scales with future design, and if Fusion World is ever going to be anything like Masters, yellow having access to 1 additional energy is actually a really big deal. But at the same time, that's all very speculative and doesn't feel concrete. And actually, I could even say that about the Goku. So realistically, it actually may just be that this is potential slash lacking where they need some additional support or something to go wrong, and we just never have this row altogether. And now we're looking at a little bit more concrete, especially when you consider, I think every leader is viable here. There's no leader I look at and I'm like, you are actually just terrible because of how good their main set kits are. Any leader can get carried with some solid choices in that red just has really good mid-range pieces regardless of the leader that you play. And yellow has a really strong aggro package that kind of is irrelevant which leader you use, with having some benefits here and there. So in that regard, they all have potential, but there's just something that feels a little bit off when you consider Cooler, especially the fact he's a frontside crit leader that would really want to be a draw leader. Nothing in the yellow toolkit really supports having a crit leader in the same way that like blue does. Blue is by far the best color to have a crit frontside leader, and red just kind of gets carried by the fact that between the board control stuff, sometimes the crit early really gets annoying with the way that the late game in red plays out. But in terms of yellow, it just does not feel good at all using Cooler's front side, and you want to self-awaken as quickly as possible. And while yellow has good self-awakening tools, it's not as fast as blue, which is arguably probably what it would have wanted the most. And to close it off, we've got the starter deck Frieza, and honestly, out of the box, best leader I think in a starter deck format. And I think while yellow doesn't gain an amazing amount of things, I think the Ginyu package is the best thing that yellow gains out of the main set, which is kind of meta dependent, of course, depending on if people are like heavily playing red or anything like that. I still think the ability to restand any 2 cards that you want, gain additional combo power, gain blockers that can attack, it's just so much intrinsic value. Frieza saves you from bad sequencing because your punish of losing combo power over it is mitigated by the fact you get that combo power back. By the fact that you may have overextended is compensated for by the fact that you get your blockers back. He is such a beginner friendly leader in as far as allowing beginners to kind of do whatever they want and still put themselves in a position to be doing okay. And in the hands of skilled competitive players, the additional value you can just accrue turn over turn is incredibly stupid. I think this leader is a 100% going to be meta, a real threat that you need to contend against, and just an insane value house that actually scales with so much future design of the way the game works that I think we're going to be seeing Frieza a lot, not only in this meta, but for many sets moving forward, which is kind of funny when you consider the fact that in Masters, Golden Frieza seems to never want to die in terms of a strategy that people end up figuring out how to play. I do want to reiterate, none of this is solid, and it's kind of why I wanted to do the video this way, because it's more of a conversation piece. I don't think anything super concrete, and naturally a lot of this is speculative. We don't have a first meta, we don't have tournament data, and we don't have the online circuit to kind of get a feel of how the ladder is playing out. But overall, if I had to give my best guess of how I think all of it is going to play out in some fashion or another, this is what I think things are going to look like. With green kind of being the pillar that the entire format centralizes around, but with some strong options in every color to make sure you have a playable color. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from here. I think regardless of which color you play, you can see success. And I think regardless of which leader you pick, you can have success. Some leaders are just going to make you work harder for it, and you are going to have some sacrifices as you play the leaders that are a little bit more niche or don't have fantastic support around them right now. But I wouldn't dare call any of them bad, and I think you can have a good time with any of the ones you pick, whether that goes from your favorite character to one that speaks the most to you on a mechanic standpoint. That said though, you guys do a fantastic job of telling me when I'm wrong. So hey, how about you guys let me know in the comments below, and we'll be jumping into more deck profiles and coverage for the game, like how to win your pre-release. You guys are definitely going to want to be here for that. So again, subscribe button in the bottom, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.